At the rehearsal dinner I secretly funded with $50,000 from my trust, Brad Goldberg looked me straight in the eye and said, "You're not family, Marissa. This wedding is for people who actually matter to us." His mother Hilda nodded approvingly. "Some people just don't know their place." I didn't argue. I didn't make a scene. I simply smiled, walked away with perfect composure, and began planning exactly how Brad would discover who he'd just dismissed.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're a subscriber, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Tell us a duh.
The crystal chandeliers of the Fairmont Grand ballroom cast dancing shadows across the marble floor as I stood frozen in the elegant archway, champagne flute trembling in my manicured hand. The words had cut through the celebratory chatter like a blade through silk, sharp and devastating in their casual cruelty. "You're not family, Marissa." Brad's voice, the same voice that had whispered promises of forever just hours earlier, delivered this verdict with the cold efficiency of a judge pronouncing sentence. His perfectly styled hair caught the light as he gestured dismissively in my direction, his designer tuxedo immaculate, his expression devoid of any recognition that he was addressing the woman who had made this entire evening possible. Around us, Chicago's elite mingled in their finest attire, champagne bubbling in crystal glasses, laughter echoing off the ornate ceiling. The rehearsal dinner for his brother Johnny's wedding to Amanda Anderson was everything a society event should be: opulent, exclusive, and ruthlessly selective about who belonged. I, apparently, did not. "Some people just don't know their place," Hilda Goldberg added with a smile that never reached her cold blue eyes. Brad's mother had perfected the art of delivering insults wrapped in silk, her tone so polite that anyone overhearing might mistake her venom for gentle correction. She adjusted her pearls, real ones I noted absently, though not nearly as valuable as the strand my grandmother had left me, and continued her assessment. "It's important to maintain standards, especially for family occasions." The irony was so profound it took my breath away. The woman lecturing me about knowing my place had no idea she was addressing Marissa Bellamy, the youngest daughter of the Bellamy Hotel empire. The ballroom we stood in, my family owned it, the champagne being served, selected from my family's private reserves. The elaborate floral arrangements that had drawn gasps of admiration all evening, personally chosen by me during a discreet meeting with the florist 3 weeks ago. Every detail of this exclusive celebration, from the hand-calligraphed invitations to the 7-course dinner prepared by Chicago's most sought-after caterer, had been orchestrated and funded by the woman they were now dismissing as unworthy of their company. "Brad," I said quietly, my voice steady, despite the earthquake happening inside my chest. "Are you certain about this?" For just a moment, something flickered across his face. Uncertainty, regret. But then Johnny appeared at his side, resplendent in his custom-tailored tuxedo, his arm draped possessively around Amanda's waist. Amanda looked radiant in her rehearsal dinner gown, a stunning creation that had cost more than most people's cars, though she had no idea that I'd quietly covered the expense when the family's credit cards had mysteriously been declined. "What's the problem here?" Johnny asked, his tone already defensive. At 28, he was 2 years younger than Brad, but had inherited the same genetic predisposition toward entitlement that seemed to run in the Goldberg family like a recessive trait. "No problem," Brad replied smoothly, his businessman's facade sliding perfectly into place. "I was just explaining to Marissa that tomorrow's ceremony is a private family affair. Very intimate, limited space." Limited space. I almost laughed. The Cathedral of St. Mary held 800 guests, and I knew because I'd been the one to negotiate the booking fee when the family's first choice had fallen through, due to once again mysterious financial complications. Amanda looked uncomfortable, her gaze darting between Brad and me. We'd met only twice before, both times at carefully orchestrated casual encounters where Brad had introduced me as his friend from work. She seemed nice enough, though painfully naive about the financial realities surrounding her fairy tale wedding. Sweet Amanda probably believed her future father-in-law had generously covered all expenses out of paternal love, never suspecting that Noah Goldberg's construction business was hemorrhaging money faster than a punctured balloon. But I thought, Amanda began hesitantly. You thought correctly, Hilda interrupted with surgical precision. This is a celebration for people who understand what it means to be part of something significant. People with appropriate backgrounds. The judgment in her voice was unmistakable. To Hilda Goldberg, I was just another gold digger chasing after her son's supposed wealth. If she only knew that the modest apartment I shared with Brad was my choice, not my limitation. That the simple Honda I drove was carefully selected to maintain my cover, while my actual car, a custom Bentley, sat in climate-controlled storage across town. 3 years. For 3 years, I had maintained this elaborate deception, playing the role of Marissa, the hotel event coordinator, struggling to make ends meet while secretly funding Brad's lifestyle, his family's emergencies, and now this wedding that would cement his brother's happiness. All because I had wanted to know if Brad could love me for who I was, not what my family name could provide. The ballroom continued to sparkle around us, oblivious to the drama unfolding in its corner. Guests laughed and clinked glasses, celebrating love and family and new beginnings. They had no idea they were witnessing the death of something that had never been real to begin with. I understand, I said finally, my voice carrying a quiet dignity that seemed to surprise them all. I carefully placed my champagne glass on a nearby table, the crystal making the softest chime against the marble surface. You're absolutely right, some people don't know their place. I reached into my small evening clutch and withdrew the key to the penthouse apartment I'd purchased for Brad as a surprise wedding gift. The one where I'd planned to finally reveal the truth about who I really was after the ceremony. Instead, I placed it gently on the table beside my abandoned champagne. Congratulations on tomorrow's wedding, I said, looking directly at Johnny and Amanda. I hope you get exactly the celebration you deserve. Then I turned to Brad, my expression serene, my smile perfectly composed. And you, darling, will get exactly what you've earned. Without another word, I walked away, my heels clicking against the marble in a steady rhythm that matched my heartbeat. I didn't run. I didn't stumble. I didn't look back at the confused faces or hushed whispers that followed in my wake. Behind me, I heard Brad's voice calling my name, but it sounded distant and unimportant, like an echo from someone else's life. Someone else's heartbreak. The valet brought my Honda to the front entrance with practiced efficiency, and I slipped him a tip that probably exceeded his weekly salary. As I drove away from the Fairmont Grand, away from the ballroom I owned, the celebration I'd funded, and the man who'd just made the costliest mistake of his life, I allowed myself exactly 30 seconds of pure grief. 30 seconds to mourn not just Brad, who had revealed himself to be exactly as shallow as I'd feared, but the dream I'd cherished that someone could love me, without knowing about the Bellamy fortune. 30 seconds for the fantasy that had died alongside my carefully constructed identity. When those 30 seconds ended, I dried my eyes, straightened my shoulders, and began mentally composing the phone calls that would transform tomorrow's wedding from a celebration into a reckoning. After all, Brad was right about one thing: some people really don't know their place. And he was about to learn exactly what his was. The 30-minute drive to my real home should have given me time to process what had just happened, but my mind remained strangely calm as I navigated Chicago's downtown streets. Perhaps it was shock.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Or perhaps it was simply relief that the pretense was finally over. Either way, by the time I pulled into the private underground garage of the Bellamy Tower, I felt oddly detached from the entire evening, as if I'd been watching someone else's humiliation rather than living through my own. The elevator whisked me silently to the 42nd floor, where my actual apartment waited, a penthouse that occupied the entire top level of the building my great-grandfather had commissioned in 1952. The contrast with Brad's cramped two-bedroom rental was so stark it might have been funny under different circumstances. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Lake Michigan, the water black as ink beneath the moonlight. Original Monet paintings graced the walls, not reproductions, but pieces my grandmother had personally acquired during her friendship with the artist's son. Persian rugs that had taken master craftsmen years to complete covered polished hardwood floors, imported from sustainable forests in Oregon. This was who I really was. Not Marissa, the struggling event coordinator, who clipped coupons and worried about credit card bills. Not the woman who wore the same 3 business suits in careful rotation to create the illusion of a limited wardrobe. I was Marissa Bellamy, third-generation heiress to a hospitality empire that spanned 14 countries and employed over 30,000 people worldwide. I kicked off my heels and walked barefoot across the cool marble of my foyer, past the crystal chandelier that had once hung in a French chateau, past the mahogany dining table where I'd hosted ambassadors and Fortune 500 CEOs. In my walk-in closet, larger than Brad's entire living room, I peeled away the carefully chosen dress that had cost precisely what a woman in my fictional income bracket might splurge on for a special occasion. The reflection staring back at me from my full-length mirror looked different somehow. Maybe it was the absence of the performance anxiety that had become second nature after 3 years of constant deception. Maybe it was simply exhaustion. But for the first time in years, I looked like myself rather than the character I'd been playing. My phone buzzed insistently on the nightstand. 17 missed calls from Brad, 12 from Johnny, even 3 from Amanda. I ignored them all, and instead placed a very different kind of call. Bellamy residence, this is Margaret. Our family's longtime housekeeper answered on the second ring, her British accent as crisp as ever despite the late hour. Margaret, it's me, is Dad still awake? Miss Marissa, he's in the study, actually. Shall I put you through? Within seconds, my father's familiar voice filled the silence of my penthouse. Darling, what's wrong? You sound strange. Richard Bellamy had built our family's modest Chicago hotel chain into an international empire through a combination of shrewd business instincts and an uncanny ability to read people. He'd known from the beginning that my relationship with Brad was doomed, but he'd respected my need to discover the truth for myself. The experiment is over, Dad. I settled into my favorite armchair, the one where I'd spent countless childhood evenings reading while he worked nearby. You were right about him. The silence stretched for several heartbeats before he responded. What happened? I told him everything. The rehearsal dinner I'd secretly funded, Hilda's casual cruelty, Brad's dismissal of me as someone who didn't belong with their family. With each detail I shared, I could practically hear my father's blood pressure rising. That pompous, ungrateful little, he caught himself, reverting to the diplomatic tone that had served him well in countless business negotiations. I'm sorry, sweetheart. I know you hoped for better. I did hope, I admitted, surprised by how little pain accompanied the admission. But I think I've known for months that he wasn't who I thought he was. Tonight just made it official. And tomorrow's wedding. I smiled for the first time since leaving the rehearsal dinner. Oh, that's going to be very interesting. My father chuckled, recognizing the tone I'd inherited from him. the one that emerged when someone had made the mistake of underestimating a Bellamy. What do you need from me? For starters, I want you to call Marcus at the cathedral. Tell him there's been a change regarding tomorrow's ceremony arrangements. Done. What else? Contact Sarah at Bellamy Catering. I want to know exactly how much of tomorrow's reception we're underwriting. I pulled up my laptop as I spoke, fingers already flying across the keyboard. Then call the florist, the photographer, the string quartet. I want a complete accounting of every vendor we've supported either directly or through our subsidiary companies. The true scope of my family's involvement in Johnny and Amanda's wedding had been carefully obscured through a network of shell companies and third-party contracts. To the Goldbergs, it appeared that various vendors had offered generous discounts or pro bono services out of professional courtesy. They had no idea that every lucky break they'd received could be traced back to the woman they'd just dismissed as unworthy of their company. Marissa, my father said carefully, I want them to pay for what they did to you, but remember that an innocent girl is getting married tomorrow. Amanda doesn't deserve to have her wedding destroyed. You're right, I agreed, my fingers pausing over the keyboard. Amanda deserves exactly the wedding she's dreamed of. A beautiful ceremony, surrounded by people who love her, celebrating the beginning of her marriage to a man who adores her. Then what? She deserves all of that, I continued, with a groom who hasn't built his entire relationship on lies. Don't you think? Another pause, longer this time. When my father spoke again, his voice carried the mixture of pride and concern that had characterized our relationship since childhood. What have you discovered about Johnny? Nothing yet, I admitted. But Brad learned his patterns from somewhere. And I have 18 hours before that wedding begins to find out exactly what kind of man Amanda is really marrying. I could hear him moving around his study, probably pouring himself the single glass of bourbon he allowed himself each evening. You'll need help. I'll need Marcus Rudd. Marcus Rudd was our family's most trusted private investigator, a former FBI agent whose discretion was matched only by his thoroughness. If there were secrets in Johnny Goldberg's past, Marcus would find them. I'll call him tonight, my father promised. Marissa, are you sure about this? Once you reveal who you really are, there's no going back to your old life. I looked around my penthouse, at the authentic artwork and custom furniture, at the life I'd abandoned to play a role that had never been real. Through my windows, Chicago glittered like a constellation, a city where my family name commanded respect and my word carried weight. Good, I said softly. I'm tired of pretending to be less than I am. After we hung up, I poured myself a glass of wine from my private reserve, a vintage that cost more than Brad's monthly rent, and settled in to wait for Marcus's call. By morning I would know everything there was to know about the Goldberg family. And by tomorrow evening they would finally understand exactly who they had dismissed as unworthy of their company. The game was about to begin. 3 years ago, I had been a different person entirely. Fresh out of Harvard Business School with an MBA and a head full of idealistic notions about love conquering all, I'd returned to Chicago determined to prove that I could build meaningful relationships based on who I was rather than what my family owned. The irony, of course, was that in order to be loved for myself, I'd had to become someone else entirely. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. It began with a conversation in my father's study, much like the one we'd just finished, though the roles had been reversed then. Every relationship you've had has been tainted by this, I'd argued, gesturing toward the family portraits that lined the mahogany-paneled walls. Harvard prep school, even high school, they all knew who I was before they knew me. How can I ever be certain someone loves Marissa, rather than the Bellamy fortune? My father had listened patiently, His fingers steepled beneath his chin in the way that meant he was taking my concerns seriously, despite their apparent naivety. Love isn't a business transaction, darling. It doesn't require controlled conditions to be authentic. Doesn't it? I challenged. Tell me honestly, Dad. When you met Mom, would she have given you a second glance if you'd been Richard the hotel night manager instead of Richard Bellamy, heir to the family empire? The question had hit its mark. My parents' love story was legendary in Chicago society circles, but it had begun at a charity gala, where my father's name was prominently displayed on the donor list. My mother, God rest her soul, had been many wonderful things, but naive about wealth and status wasn't among them. That conversation had planted the seed of an idea that grew into an elaborate plan. I would temporarily step away from the family business, create a modest identity, and see if I could find someone who would love me without the Bellamy name attached. It seemed romantic at the time, like something out of a Victorian novel. The execution had been surprisingly simple. I rented a small apartment in Lincoln Park under my middle name, Marissa Cole, and created a carefully constructed background as an event coordinator for mid-tier hotels. The job wasn't entirely fictional. I'd worked in various departments of our family hotels during summers throughout college, but I presented myself as someone struggling to climb the corporate ladder rather than someone who could buy the entire company with her trust fund. I met Brad 6 months into my experiment, at a networking event for hospitality professionals. He'd been there representing Goldberg Construction, trying to drum up business from hotel developers, and I'd been immediately struck by his confidence. He worked the room like a man who knew his worth, shaking hands with easy charm and discussing million-dollar projects as if they were routine. Marissa Cole, I'd introduced myself when he approached my corner of the bar. Brad Goldberg, he'd replied, his smile warm and seemingly genuine. I don't think we've met. What hotel are you with? I'd given him my rehearsed background, event coordinator at the Palmer House, working my way up, hoping to eventually move into hotel management. He'd listened with what appeared to be genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions about my career goals and the challenges of working in such a competitive industry. That first conversation lasted 2 hours. We talked about everything from Chicago architecture to our favorite restaurants, from travel dreams to family dynamics. He'd seemed impressed by my work ethic when I mentioned pulling double shifts to afford my apartment. I'd been charmed by his stories about building the family construction business alongside his father and brother. You're different, he'd said, as the event was winding down. Most people in this industry are either completely cynical or completely naive. You seem to have found the perfect balance. If only he'd known how much balance my deception actually required. Our first date had been dinner at a casual Italian place on North Clark Street. I'd insisted on splitting the check, playing the role of the independent woman who couldn't afford expensive restaurants. Brad had protested, but not too strenuously, and I'd noticed the slight relief in his eyes when I'd pulled out my wallet. That should have been my first warning sign, but I'd been too caught up in the romance of it all to pay attention. Here was a successful businessman who seemed impressed by my work ethic rather than intimidated by my family connections, who valued my opinions about business and listened when I talked about my dreams, who made me laugh and held doors and remembered that I preferred white wine to red. For 6 months, our relationship had been everything I'd hoped for. Brad was attentive without being clingy, ambitious without being ruthless, charming without being fake. He'd introduced me to his friends as his girlfriend with obvious pride. He'd surprised me with thoughtful gifts, not expensive ones, but items that showed he'd been paying attention to my interests. The cracks had begun to show around month 7, when Brad started experiencing what he called cash flow problems with the family business. Nothing major, he'd assured me, Just the usual challenges of waiting for clients to pay their invoices while having to meet payroll and cover materials costs. "I hate asking," he'd said one evening over dinner, his expression genuinely pained. "But would you be able to help me cover rent this month? Just until the Morrison project payment comes through. I'll pay you back with interest." I'd agreed immediately, touched that he trusted me enough to share his financial struggles. The fact that he'd offered to pay interest had seemed like proof of his integrity. A man trying to take advantage wouldn't worry about such details, would he? The repayment had come through exactly as promised, along with flowers and a heartfelt thank you note. When he'd needed help again 2 months later, equipment rental for a big job that would pay off handsomely, I'd been even more willing to assist. Looking back now, I could see how expertly he'd played the game. The small requests that were always repaid promptly, building trust for the larger ones that would follow. The careful way he'd presented each financial crisis as temporary and specific, never part of a pattern. The genuine gratitude that made me feel like a partner rather than a victim. By the time the requests became regular, and the repayments became sporadic, I was too emotionally invested to see clearly. I'd convinced myself that supporting someone I loved through difficult times was what relationships were about. I'd been so focused on protecting myself from gold diggers that I'd never consider I might be the gold being dug. The wine had grown warm in my glass while I'd been lost in memories. Outside my penthouse windows, Chicago slept peacefully, unaware that tomorrow would bring revelations that would shake one of its oldest families to their very foundations. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus Rudd, "Preliminary report ready. You're not going to like what I found." I smiled grimly and reached for my laptop. Time to learn exactly what kind of man Amanda Anderson was planning to marry in 12 hours. For 3 years, my life had been an exhausting masterpiece of deception, choreographed down to the smallest detail. Every morning began the same way, standing in front of 2 closets in 2 different apartments, transforming myself from Marissa Bellamy into Marissa Cole with the precision of a method actor preparing for the performance of her life. My alarm would sound at 5:30 a.m. in the Lincoln Park apartment I shared with Brad, a deliberately modest 2-bedroom rental that I'd chosen specifically for its cramped kitchen and outdated fixtures. The woman who woke up there wore Target pajamas and worried about electric bills. She checked her bank balance obsessively on a phone with a cracked screen, and counted out exact change for her morning coffee. The metamorphosis began in the shower, where I used drugstore shampoo instead of the custom-blended products my stylist created exclusively for me. I'd learned to apply makeup with the efficiency of someone who had exactly 20 minutes before catching the blue line to work, creating the appearance of natural beauty achieved through good genes rather than expensive cosmetics. My wardrobe for Marissa Cole consisted of carefully curated pieces from department stores and outlet malls, professional enough for my supposed position as an event coordinator, but never so polished that they'd suggest access to serious money. 3 suits rotated through my weekly schedule: navy, charcoal, and brown. The brown one had a barely visible stain on the left sleeve that I'd deliberately preserved, because it told the story of a woman who couldn't afford to replace clothing over minor imperfections. The jewelry was perhaps the most challenging aspect of the deception. My real collection included pieces that had been featured in Architectural Digest and Harper's Bazaar: my grandmother's Cartier tennis bracelet, the Tiffany necklace my father had given me for my 21st birthday, earrings that had once belonged to a Russian princess. Instead, I wore a simple gold chain from Target and small pearl studs that looked expensive but had cost $37. Brad would stumble out of bed around 7:15, already running late for his first construction site visit, grabbing coffee and a bagel, while I pretended to fret about whether our grocery budget could handle his tendency to eat lunch out instead of packing leftovers. These domestic moments were simultaneously the easiest and hardest parts of my performance. Easy because they felt so normal, hard because they reminded me constantly of what I was sacrificing for this experiment.
"Babe, did you remember to call about the water heater?" he'd ask, while checking his reflection in our tiny bathroom mirror, the one with the chip in the corner that I could have replaced with a single phone call to our building's maintenance staff. Instead, I'd researched repair costs and scheduled appointments with the cheapest service I could find, playing the role of a woman for whom a $300 repair represented a genuine financial burden. The commute to my fake job was its own elaborate performance. I'd take the train with actual commuters, standing pressed against strangers who smelled of coffee and resignation, while my BMW sat in climate-controlled storage across town. I'd mastered the art of looking authentically tired by 8 a.m., the kind of exhaustion that came from worrying about money, rather than from choosing between 17 different charity galas on a weekend. At the Palmer House, where I'd convinced the general manager to let me work under my assumed identity, I spent my days coordinating events for corporate clients and wedding parties. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was planning celebrations with budgets smaller than what I typically spent on shoes, but the work provided perfect cover for my deception. Anyone checking my references would find a competent, hard-working employee who never caused problems and always stayed within budget. The most dangerous part of each day came during lunch breaks, when I'd slip away to make the phone calls that kept my real life functioning. In bathroom stalls and empty conference rooms, I'd conduct business worth millions while pretending to be someone who clipped coupons. "The Singapore acquisition needs your signature," my assistant would whisper over encrypted connections. "Your father wants to know if you can attend the board meeting Thursday. Reschedule everything," I'd reply, my voice barely audible, "and tell Dad I can't surface until this is over." These conversations required military-level operational security. I had 3 different phones, one for Marissa Cole, one for emergencies, and a third for business calls that couldn't be delayed. My assistant had instructions to route all urgent matters through intermediaries who could make decisions in my absence. Board meetings were conducted via secure video calls from rented conference rooms across the city, with me appearing as a remote participant joining from European business trips. The financial mechanics of maintaining 2 identities were staggeringly complex. Every dollar that Marissa Cole spent had to be traceable to her supposed income, which meant I kept meticulous records of a fictional budget that would have been laughable if it weren't so psychologically exhausting. I'd stand in grocery store aisles actually calculating whether I could afford name-brand cereal, while knowing I could buy the entire chain without affecting my net worth. Meanwhile, the real Marissa Bellamy's expenses continued mounting in the background. Property taxes on the penthouse, maintenance fees for storage units housing my actual belongings, salary for staff who maintained properties I couldn't visit, charitable commitments that couldn't be delayed, without raising suspicions in social circles I'd temporarily abandoned. The most emotionally draining aspect wasn't the financial juggling or the constant performance anxiety, it was the isolation. I couldn't confide in friends who knew my real identity without risking exposure. I couldn't make new friends as Marissa Cole without building relationships on lies. I existed in a social limbo, surrounded by people but authentically known by none of them. Evening brought its own challenges. Brad would come home full of stories about his day, complaints about clients, dreams about expanding the business. I'd listen with the appropriate level of concern and support, offering advice that was carefully calibrated to seem insightful but not suspiciously sophisticated. When he'd complain about competitors underbidding projects, I couldn't mention that I knew 3 of those companies' CEOs personally. When he'd worry about securing permits, I couldn't reveal that I'd shared dinner with the city planning commissioner just last month. The loneliness was crushing.
Here was this man I was falling in love with, sharing his hopes and fears, while I responded with a carefully constructed persona that bore only surface resemblance to who I actually was. Every intimate moment was tainted by the knowledge that he was connecting with a fiction, that the woman he claimed to love existed only in the space between us. Some nights, lying awake beside him in our cramped bedroom, I'd stare at the ceiling and wonder if I'd lost myself so completely in the performance that there was nothing authentic left to discover. Tomorrow's wedding would finally answer that question. The transformation from girlfriend to financial benefactor had been so gradual, so expertly orchestrated, that I hadn't recognized the pattern until it was too late to extract myself without admitting the scope of my deception. What began as occasional assistance during Brad's supposed cash flow problems had evolved into a complex web of financial dependency that now threatened to expose everything I'd worked to hide. It started small, as these things always do. 6 months into our relationship, Brad had mentioned over dinner that a client was late with payment, leaving him short on rent. The request was presented as a temporary embarrassment, something that wounded his pride to even mention. "I've never had to ask anyone for money before," he'd said, his face flushed with what appeared to be genuine shame. "But the Morrison account owes us $12,000, and they keep pushing back the payment date. If you could just cover my half of rent this month, I'll pay you back with interest the moment their check clears." I'd agreed immediately, touched by his vulnerability, and impressed by his insistence on paying interest. $400 seemed insignificant, less than I typically spent on a single dinner at Le Bernardin, but to Marissa Cole it represented a significant sacrifice. I'd made a show of checking my bank balance twice, of calculating whether I could manage without the money until my next fictional paycheck. The repayment had come exactly as promised, along with an additional $50 and a bouquet of flowers. "Thank you for believing in me," the card had read. "I'm lucky to have someone who supports my dreams." That success had established the template for everything that followed. Each subsequent request was carefully justified, always temporary, always with a clear repayment schedule. Equipment rental for a major project that would net significant profits. Materials for a renovation that a wealthy client was financing up front. Bridge loans for payroll when seasonal work left the company temporarily strapped. By year 2, the amounts had escalated dramatically. What started as hundreds became thousands, justified by increasingly sophisticated explanations about construction industry cash flow patterns. Brad would spread blueprints across our kitchen table, pointing to project timelines and payment schedules, making me feel like a trusted business partner rather than a source of emergency funding. "This is the big one, babe," he'd explained last fall, his finger tracing architectural drawings for a luxury condominium complex. 50 units. Premium finishes, lakefront location. The developer wants us exclusively, but we need capital to purchase materials up front. $12,000 would cover everything until the first milestone payment comes through. I transferred the money that same evening, watching his face light up with relief and gratitude. The kiss he'd given me afterward had felt like a promise, a wordless acknowledgement that we were building something together that transcended traditional relationship boundaries. But the pattern had continued expanding. Johnny's engagement ring, $3,000 that Brad couldn't access without explaining the expense to his business partner father. His mother's medical bills when she'd needed a procedure her insurance wouldn't cover. Emergency repairs on construction equipment that couldn't wait for the next project payment. Each crisis felt legitimate in isolation, but the cumulative effect was staggering. My careful records showed that over 36 months Marissa Cole had somehow managed to provide nearly $60,000 in financial support while earning less than $40,000 annually in her fake job. The mathematics should have been impossible, but Brad had never questioned the logistics, apparently content to accept that his girlfriend was simply better with money than he was. The wedding expenses had represented the most elaborate test of the system. When Noah Goldberg had quietly approached Brad about financial difficulties covering Johnny's celebration, I'd watched my boyfriend's face cycle through embarrassment, calculation, and finally resigned determination. "I can't let my brother's wedding be anything less than perfect," he'd told me that night. "Johnny deserves the best, and Amanda's family is expecting something sophisticated. But Dad's cash flow is tight with 3 major projects delayed until spring." The request hadn't been direct. Brad was too skilled for such crude manipulation. Instead, he'd simply shared his family's crisis and let me draw my own conclusions about how to help. When I'd suggested using my savings to cover the shortfall, he'd protested just enough to maintain the appearance of reluctance before accepting with profound gratitude. $50,000 had moved from my trust fund through a labyrinthine series of shell companies and intermediary payments, ultimately appearing to the Goldberg family as a collection of vendor discounts, promotional rates, and fortunate timing. The cathedral booking that had fallen through for another couple, creating an opening for Johnny and Amanda. The florist who'd supposedly had a last-minute cancellation, allowing them to provide premium arrangements at a fraction of the usual cost. The photographer whose schedule had miraculously opened up due to another client's postponement. Every stroke of luck that had made their dream wedding possible could be traced back to the woman they'd just dismissed as unworthy of their family circle. The woman who'd sacrificed not just money but months of careful coordination to ensure their son's happiness. As I sat in my penthouse reviewing Marcus Rudd's preliminary report on Johnny Goldberg, the full scope of their ingratitude crystallized into something cold and calculated. They'd built their celebration on my generosity while simultaneously excluding me from participating in the joy I'd made possible. That mistake was about to cost them everything they thought they'd gained. The numbers on Marcus's report were already telling their own story, and dawn was still hours away. The first crack in my carefully constructed reality appeared on a Tuesday evening in February, so subtle I almost missed it entirely. Brad had texted earlier that he'd be working late at the Riverside project site, dealing with what he described as foundation issues that can't wait. I'd prepared his favorite lasagna, timing it perfectly for his usual 8 p.m. return, and settled in to wait with a glass of wine and the latest hospitality industry reports I needed to review for my fake job. By 10:30, the lasagna was cold and my calls were going straight to voicemail. When Brad finally walked through our apartment door just after midnight, I noticed something that made my heart skip in a way that had nothing to do with relief. His boots were spotless. After 15 hours supposedly troubleshooting foundation problems at a muddy construction site, his work boots should have been caked with dirt and concrete dust. Instead, they gleamed as if they'd just been polished. His jeans were pristine, his flannel shirt still bore the crisp creases from this morning's ironing. Even his hands, which should have been stained with the grime that came from construction work, looked as if he'd just finished a manicure. "Long day?" I asked carefully, watching his face as he kicked off those suspiciously clean boots. "Brutal," he replied, not meeting my eyes as he headed for the bathroom. "Foundation's completely unstable. We'll probably be dealing with this for weeks." The shower ran for 20 minutes longer than usual, and when he emerged, I caught the faint scent of perfume clinging to his damp hair. Not my perfume. Something floral and expensive, with base notes I didn't recognize. "Everything okay at the site?" I pressed gently as he climbed into bed beside me. "Just contractor stuff. Nothing interesting." His response was automatic, dismissive. "Hey, did you remember to transfer that payment for the equipment rental? The check needs to clear by Friday or we'll lose the deposit." The deflection was smooth, professional. Redirect attention to my financial contribution rather than discuss the details of his day. I made a mental note of the technique even as I assured him the money would be available as requested. The second crack appeared 3 days later. I decided to surprise Brad with lunch at the construction site, a gesture that fit perfectly with my role as the supportive girlfriend who didn't question his demanding schedule. The Riverside project was supposedly consuming 12 hours of his day, requiring his personal oversight of every detail. The site was empty. Not just quiet, completely abandoned, with no evidence of recent activity. The foundation Brad had described as catastrophically unstable looked perfectly normal to my untrained eyes. A security guard informed me that work had been suspended for 2 weeks due to permit delays, and that he hadn't seen any Goldberg construction workers since the previous Monday. Standing in that deserted lot, staring at equipment covered by tarps, I felt something fundamental shift inside my chest. The man I'd been supporting financially and emotionally for nearly 3 years had lied to me with the casual fluency of someone for whom deception was second nature. I drove home in a daze, mechanically preparing dinner while my mind raced through recent conversations, searching for other inconsistencies I might have missed while playing my role too well. The girlfriend who trusted blindly, who asked few questions, who was grateful for whatever attention she received between Brad's demanding professional commitments. That evening, I did something I'd never done before. I actively listened for lies. How did the foundation issue resolve? I asked over our reheated lasagna. Still working on it, Brad replied without missing a beat. Brought in a specialist consultant today, expensive but necessary for a project this size. The lie rolled off his tongue with practiced ease. No hesitation, no guilty tells, no indication that he was describing events that had never happened at a location he hadn't visited. Must be frustrating, dealing with delays like that. Part of the business, he shrugged, already reaching for his phone as it buzzed with a text message. His face illuminated briefly as he read, and I caught a flash of something that looked suspiciously like a smile before he schooled his expression back to professional concern. Work? I asked innocently. Yeah, Johnny needs help with something. Family stuff. Another smooth deflection, but this time I noticed how quickly he angled the phone away from my view, how his thumb moved to delete the message before setting the device face down on the table. The third crack was financial. Discovered during my weekly ritual of balancing Marissa Cole's carefully constructed budget. The equipment rental payment Brad had requested, $2,000 for specialized foundation repair tools, had been processed exactly as he'd asked. But when I discreetly called the rental company to confirm the transaction, they had no record of any equipment being rented to Goldberg Construction in the past month. $2,000 had vanished into whatever Brad was actually doing with his time, leaving behind only a web of lies that grew more complex with each conversation. Sitting at our kitchen table with bank statements and rental receipts spread before me, I faced an uncomfortable truth. I'd been so focused on hiding my own deception that I'd missed the signs of his. While I'd been carefully constructing Marissa Cole's modest existence, Brad had been constructing something entirely different, a version of his life that bore no resemblance to reality. The foundation problems at Riverside were fictional, the late nights at construction sites were fabricated. The financial crises requiring my support were either exaggerated or entirely invented. But if Brad wasn't working overtime on construction projects, where was he spending his evenings? And what exactly was he doing with the money I'd been providing to solve problems that apparently didn't exist? As I closed my laptop and prepared for bed, I made a decision that would have been unthinkable just days earlier. Tomorrow, I would start investigating the man I thought I loved, using skills I'd developed in the business world to uncover truths he'd been carefully hiding. The woman who'd been played for a fool was about to become the player herself. The decision to investigate Brad systematically transformed me from a naive girlfriend into something far more dangerous, a woman with unlimited resources, advanced business training, and a growing suspicion that she'd been manipulated by an expert. What Brad didn't know, couldn't have imagined, was that he'd chosen to deceive someone whose family had built an empire on the ability to uncover hidden truths about people and properties. My first move was to create distance, both physical and emotional, that would allow me to observe without being observed. I told Brad I'd been selected for a special project requiring weekend travel, a plausible explanation given my supposed career in hotel event coordination. In reality, I moved temporarily into a corporate suite at the Bellamy downtown, giving me access to resources and privacy that my cramped Lincoln Park apartment couldn't provide. From my command center 30 floors above Michigan Avenue, I began mapping Brad's actual schedule against the version he'd been presenting to me. The tools at my disposal would have impressed a federal investigator, private security firms on retainer, forensic accountants who specialized in uncovering financial irregularities, and a network of contacts throughout Chicago's business community, who owed favors to the Bellamy family. The first breakthrough came within 48 hours. Marcus Rudd's preliminary surveillance revealed that Brad's foundation crisis meetings were actually lunch dates at Gibson's Bar and Steakhouse with a woman I didn't recognize. The photos Marcus provided showed them laughing intimately over expensive wine, her hand resting casually on his arm, in a gesture that spoke of comfort and familiarity. She was stunning in the way that suggested professional maintenance, perfect highlights that cost more than most people's rent, a Hermes handbag that required a waiting list, designer clothing that fit with the precision only achieved through custom tailoring. Everything about her screamed wealth and sophistication, the polar opposite of the struggling event coordinator I'd been pretending to be. Her name is Faye Anderson, Marcus reported during our secure phone call. 28 years old, pharmaceutical sales representative for Morrison Laboratory. Lives in a penthouse apartment in River North that runs $7,000 a month. Drives a brand new BMW X5. I absorbed this information while staring at the photographs spread across my hotel suite's conference table. How long have they been meeting? Based on restaurant receipts I was able to access, at least 4 months. Always the same table, always during hours when he's supposedly working. Yesterday's lunch lasted 3 hours and included champagne. 4 months, while I'd been transferring thousands of dollars to support his fictional construction crises, Brad had been conducting an elaborate courtship with a woman whose lifestyle suggested she didn't need financial assistance from anyone. The second revelation was even more damaging. Financial records showed that the equipment rental payments I'd been covering weren't disappearing into construction costs. They were funding Brad's relationship with Faye. Expensive dinners, weekend trips to Wisconsin ski resorts, jewelry purchases from Tiffany that matched items I'd seen in the surveillance photos. There's more, Marcus continued grimly. I ran background checks on both Brad and his family. The Goldberg Construction Company is 3 months behind on major contracts and facing potential bankruptcy. But here's the interesting part. Johnny Goldberg has been secretly negotiating to merge with Anderson Development Group. My blood chilled as the implications became clear. Anderson, as in Faye's father. Richard Anderson owns one of the largest commercial development firms in the Midwest. If Johnny marries Amanda Anderson and Brad becomes involved with Faye, the Goldbergs would essentially be positioning themselves to be absorbed into a much more successful family business. I set down the phone and walked to my suite's floor-to-ceiling windows, staring down at the city where I'd been born and raised, where my family's name commanded respect, and my real identity could destroy the carefully constructed plans of people who saw me as nothing more than a temporary funding source. The pattern was becoming sickeningly clear. This wasn't just an affair, it was a calculated business strategy disguised as romance. The Goldberg men weren't looking for love, they were looking for acquisitions. Johnny had secured Amanda Anderson, presumably for her family connections. Brad was cultivating Faye Anderson for the same reason. And I, naive, trusting Marissa Cole, had been serving as their bridge loan, providing the financial stability they needed to appear attractive to their real targets. Keep digging, I told Marcus when I picked up the phone again. I want to know everything about the Anderson family connections, the timeline of when Brad first contacted Faye, and exactly how much money I've unknowingly contributed to his courtship of another woman. What about surveillance on Johnny? Given tomorrow's wedding, especially Johnny, I interrupted. If this is a family pattern, I want documentation. Amanda deserves to know what she's marrying into. After Marcus hung up, I poured myself a glass of wine and settled into the leather chair where I'd made my first $1 million deals as a teenager learning the family business. The view from this height made Chicago look manageable, like a chessboard where pieces could be moved with strategic precision. Brad thought he was playing a sophisticated game, using my money to fund his pursuit of a woman who could offer him real wealth and status. He'd underestimated his opponent so completely that he'd never bothered to research who he was stealing from. That mistake was about to cost him everything he'd worked to achieve. The investigation was just beginning, and I had resources he couldn't imagine and motivations he'd never expected. By the time I was finished, the Goldberg family would understand exactly what it meant to underestimate a Bellamy. The smoking gun arrived at 3:17 a.m. on a Thursday morning, delivered through encrypted channels that traced back to Marcus Rudd's most reliable sources. I'd been awake for hours in my hotel suite, unable to sleep while knowing that somewhere across the city, Brad was lying in our shared bed, probably dreaming about his future with Faye Anderson while surrounded by furniture I'd helped him afford. The evidence Marcus had compiled was devastating in its thoroughness. Bank records showed a pattern of financial manipulation that stretched back to the very beginning of our relationship. Every crisis Brad had presented to me, the delayed client payments, the equipment emergencies, the family medical bills, had corresponding deposits into accounts linked to his courtship of Faye. But the most damaging discovery was hidden in a cloud storage account that Brad had apparently forgotten to secure properly. Marcus's technical specialist had found it during a routine digital investigation, protected by a password so obvious it bordered on insulting. Future 2024. Inside were folders labeled with clinical precision: Marissa Financial, Anderson Strategy, and most chillingly, Exit Timeline. I opened the files with hands that trembled slightly, though whether from rage or heartbreak, I couldn't say. The Marissa Financial folder contained spreadsheets that reduced our 3-year relationship to a series of profit and loss calculations. Each loan I'd provided was meticulously recorded alongside its actual use: a $2,000 equipment rental that had funded a weekend getaway to Lake Geneva with Faye, a $5,000 medical emergency that had purchased the diamond bracelet she wore in Marcus's surveillance photos. The calculations were ruthlessly precise. My total contribution, $63,400 over 36 months. Brad's return on investment, access to Faye Anderson and her father's business empire, valued conservatively at $847 million. In the margins he'd written notes like "MA continues to accept explanations without verification," and "emotional manipulation highly effective, suggest family crisis scenarios for larger amounts." I was listed not as his girlfriend, but as primary funding source temporary. The Anderson Strategy folder revealed the true scope of his deception. Brad had been researching Faye and her family for over a year before our first chance encounter at the hospitality networking event. He'd studied her social media, learned her schedule, even discovered her favorite restaurants and charitable causes. Their relationship hadn't developed organically. It had been planned with the precision of a hostile corporate takeover. Screenshots of their text conversations made my stomach turn. While he'd been texting me about working late and missing dinner, he'd been sending Faye messages that ranged from romantic to explicitly sexual. "Can't wait to be done playing house with the temp," read one message from just 2 weeks ago. "Soon it'll just be us and everything we've planned." But it was the Exit Timeline folder that transformed my heartbreak into something cold and calculating. Brad had created a detailed schedule for ending our relationship, timed precisely to coincide with Johnny's wedding and his own transition into the Anderson family circle. The plan was methodical, designed to minimize financial disruption, while maximizing his positioning for the future. Phase 1 had already begun, gradually reducing contact while increasing requests for financial support, designed to make me feel grateful for whatever attention I received. Phase 2, scheduled for next week, involved creating a manufactured crisis that would require me to choose between supporting him or maintaining our relationship. When I inevitably chose to help financially, he would use my controlling behavior around money as justification for ending things. Phase 3 was particularly cruel. He planned to publicly announce his relationship with Faye at Johnny's wedding reception, presenting their romance as something that had developed after our breakup. The timeline showed he'd calculated exactly how long he needed to maintain plausible deniability about the overlap between our relationships. The final insult was a note to himself about recovering Marissa's financial contributions through legal intimidation if necessary. He'd apparently consulted with an attorney about claiming that my loans constituted illegal interference in his business relationships, potentially making me liable for damages if I demanded repayment after their relationship ended. I closed the laptop and walked to my suite's windows, staring down at Chicago's sleeping skyline while processing the full scope of what I'd uncovered. This wasn't just an affair, or even a calculated betrayal. It was a sophisticated con game that had been planned from the very beginning. Every moment of our relationship that I'd treasured as authentic had been carefully scripted to maximize his financial gain while positioning him for a more advantageous future. The man I'd thought I loved had never existed. In his place was a predator who'd studied my weaknesses, exploited my desire for genuine connection, and reduced me to a line item in his business plan. But Brad had made one crucial miscalculation in his elaborate scheme. He'd chosen to manipulate someone whose real resources dwarfed everything he was scheming to obtain. The woman he'd dismissed as a temporary funding source actually controlled more wealth and wielded more influence than the Anderson family he was so desperately trying to infiltrate. I picked up my secure phone and dialed Marcus's number. When he answered on the first ring, I said simply, "It's time to move to the next phase. I want complete files on both Anderson daughters, full background on their father's business practices, and a comprehensive plan for what happens when we reveal everything tomorrow." And Brad? Marcus asked. I smiled, looking out at the city where my family had built an empire on the principle that information was the ultimate weapon. Brad's about to learn that some temporary arrangements have permanent consequences. The game had changed entirely. Now it was my turn to play. The revelation that I was dealing with a systematic predator rather than a simple cheater hit me like ice water at dawn. As I sat in my hotel suite reviewing Marcus's expanded investigation, the true scope of the Goldberg family operation began to crystallize into something far more chilling than I'd imagined. This wasn't just Brad's individual scheme, it was a multi-generational pattern of manipulation that had been refined over decades. Marcus's research revealed that Noah Goldberg, the family patriarch, had built his construction business through a series of strategic marriages and relationships that provided capital at crucial moments. His first wife, Brad's mother, had brought a substantial inheritance that funded the company's initial expansion. When she died in a car accident 15 years ago, Noah had remarried within 8 months to a widow whose life insurance settlement conveniently covered the company's debts from a failed hotel project. The current Mrs. Goldberg, Hilda, had arrived with impeccable timing, bringing not just money but social connections that opened doors to municipal contracts and high-end residential projects. Her previous husband's mysterious death in a boating accident had left her with assets that Noah's business desperately needed. The marriage certificate was dated exactly 37 days after her first husband's funeral. It's a family tradition, Marcus explained during our secure video call, his voice grim as he shared documents that painted a picture of calculated emotional manipulation spanning 2 generations. The Goldberg men don't just marry for love, they marry for acquisitions. And they're very good at identifying vulnerable targets with valuable resources. The pattern extended to Brad and Johnny's generation with disturbing precision. Johnny's previous relationship had been with a young woman named Sarah Chen, whose family owned a successful import business. According to medical records Marcus had obtained through discreet channels, Sarah had suffered a nervous breakdown after discovering Johnny's infidelity, ultimately requiring psychiatric hospitalization. During her treatment, Johnny had systematically drained her business accounts through forged documents that her family was still fighting in court. Sarah's case never went to trial, Marcus continued, pulling up legal documents that made my stomach turn. The Goldbergs settled out of court, but only after her family's business was already destroyed. She's currently living in Seattle under psychological care, too traumatized to testify about what happened. The Amanda Anderson marriage wasn't Johnny's first attempt at infiltrating a wealthy family. It was his second successful acquisition after perfecting his techniques on a practice target who'd been discarded once her usefulness ended. Brad's history was equally disturbing. Before me, he'd maintained a 2-year relationship with a pediatric nurse named Jessica Morrison, whose father owned a chain of medical supply companies. Jessica had funded Brad's lifestyle for nearly 30 months, believing she was supporting a struggling entrepreneur who would eventually marry her. Instead, she discovered him in bed with another woman, Faye Anderson, in the apartment Jessica had been paying for. Jessica tried to sue for fraud, Marcus reported, but the Goldbergs' attorney argued that gifts between romantic partners couldn't be legally recovered. She lost her case and had to declare personal bankruptcy to pay the legal fees. She's now working 3 jobs to rebuild her credit score. The documentation Marcus had compiled painted a picture of a family that operated like a criminal enterprise, targeting emotionally vulnerable women with financial resources, extracting maximum value over extended periods, then discarding them in ways that ensured silence through trauma, legal intimidation, or financial ruin. But the most chilling discovery was hidden in Noah Goldberg's personal files, a detailed manual titled Relationship Investment Strategies that read like a predator's handbook. It contained psychological profiles of ideal targets, techniques for establishing emotional dependency, methods for gradually increasing financial requests without triggering suspicion, and exit strategies designed to prevent legal or social consequences. The manual included specific advice about identifying women who were overgenerous due to insecurity and financially capable but emotionally needy. It outlined methods for isolating targets from friends and family who might provide objective perspectives, techniques for creating manufactured crises that would trigger protective instincts, and scripts for conversations designed to make victims feel grateful for exploitation. One section was devoted entirely to legacy planning, instructions for training sons to continue the family tradition of strategic relationships. Brad and Johnny had been raised from childhood to view romantic partners as business opportunities, taught to identify and exploit emotional vulnerabilities with the same clinical precision their father used to evaluate construction contracts. I was listed in Noah's current files as Asset Class B, Moderate Resources, High Compliance, Extended Timeline Appropriate. Below my name was a note that made my blood run cold. Psychological profile suggests extended exploitation possible if emotional attachment maintained. Recommend minimum 36-month extraction period before transition to primary target. 36 months. They'd calculated exactly how long they could use me before discarding me, and that timeline was ending precisely when Brad planned to reveal his relationship with Faye Anderson at Johnny's wedding. The wedding I'd secretly funded. The celebration where I'd been dismissed as unworthy of their family circle. The event that was supposed to mark their triumph and my disposal. As I absorbed the full scope of their operation, the destroyed lives, the bankrupted women, the systematic predation disguised as romance, something fundamental shifted inside me. This wasn't about recovering my money or exposing Brad's infidelity anymore. This was about stopping a criminal enterprise that had been destroying innocent people for decades. The Goldberg family had made their final mistake when they chose to target a woman whose resources exceeded their wildest dreams, and whose tolerance for being underestimated had finally reached its limit. Tomorrow's wedding would indeed mark the end of their 36-month timeline, just not in the way they'd planned. The decision to reach out to the other victims came to me at 4 a.m., as I sat surrounded by evidence that painted the Goldberg family as serial emotional predators. These women deserved to know they weren't alone, that their trauma had been part of a calculated pattern, rather than personal failures. More importantly, I realized that individually we'd been powerless against the Goldberg's sophisticated manipulation, but together we might represent something they'd never encountered: organized resistance. Marcus had provided contact information for Jessica Morrison and Sarah Chen, along with psychological evaluations suggesting both women were stable enough to handle carefully presented information about their experiences. I spent an hour crafting an encrypted email that would reach them through secure channels, identifying myself only as another victim of the Goldberg family, and requesting a meeting to share information about a pattern they might find familiar. Sarah responded first, her message arriving just 2 hours later from Seattle. "I've been waiting 3 years for someone to contact me about this," she wrote. "I knew I wasn't crazy. I knew there had to be others." Jessica's response came that afternoon, more cautious but equally eager to connect. "If you have proof that what happened to me was intentional, I want to hear everything. I've never stopped believing that Brad planned the whole thing from the beginning." We arranged a secure video conference for that evening, each of us calling in from different cities, using encrypted software that would prevent any possibility of the Goldberg monitoring our conversation. When the three faces appeared on my laptop screen, I felt a strange mixture of sadness and validation. Sadness for the pain we'd all endured, validation that my instincts about systematic predation had been correct. Sarah spoke first, her voice steady but carrying undertones of controlled anger. "Johnny made me believe I was the love of his life for 18 months. He talked about marriage, children, growing old together. The whole time, he was systematically isolating me from my family and friends, convincing me that only he truly understood me. The isolation was crucial," Jessica added, her nurse's training evident in how she analyzed the psychological manipulation. "Brad did the same thing, gradually made me feel like his opinion was the only one that mattered, that everyone else was jealous of our relationship or didn't understand our connection." I shared the discovery of Noah's manual, watching their faces change as I read sections about emotional dependency cultivation and social network disruption techniques. The validation was immediate and profound. These women had been subjected to deliberate psychological warfare, not random relationship dysfunction. "My God," Sarah whispered. "Johnny used almost those exact phrases. I thought he was just naturally intuitive about relationships." The financial patterns were equally consistent across all three cases. Each relationship had followed the same arc: initial period of apparent financial independence from the men, followed by gradually increasing requests for support, then systematic exploitation, disguised as temporary assistance during manufactured crises. "I gave Brad $42,000 over 2 years, Jessica revealed, her voice tight with remembered humiliation. "Equipment purchases, family emergencies, business opportunities that required quick capital. Every single crisis was solved by my money, but somehow he never seemed to get ahead financially." Sarah's numbers were even higher: $68,000 to Johnny over 18 months. I mortgaged my parents' restaurant to cover what he called a bridge loan for a construction project that would make us both rich. The project never existed. When I revealed that my contributions had reached over $60,000 as well, the pattern became undeniable. The Goldberg men had refined their techniques to extract approximately the same amount from each victim, enough to significantly impact their financial stability while remaining below the threshold that might trigger serious legal investigation. "There's something else," Sarah said quietly. "After Johnny discarded me, I tried to warn Amanda Anderson through social media. I sent her private messages explaining what her fiancé had done to me, with documentation of the financial fraud." "What happened?" I asked. Though I suspected I knew the answer. "Her father threatened to sue me for harassment and defamation. Their lawyers sent cease and desist letters claiming I was a disturbed ex-girlfriend trying to sabotage their family's happiness. I was already financially ruined and psychologically devastated. I couldn't fight a legal battle against wealthy people who could afford better attorneys than I could." Jessica nodded grimly. "I tried to report Brad to the police, but without evidence of explicit fraud, which they were careful never to provide. It was just a civil matter. Gifts between romantic partners can't be recovered even when they're obtained through deception." The picture that emerged from our conversation was of a predatory operation that had been carefully designed to exploit both legal loopholes and social assumptions about romantic relationships. The Goldbergs had identified that emotional manipulation fell into a gray area where victims had little recourse, especially when the perpetrators maintained plausible deniability about their intentions. "But now we're three people with documented evidence of a systematic pattern," I pointed out. "And I have resources they don't know about." Sarah leaned forward, her expression intense. "What kind of resources?" "I made a decision that would fundamentally alter the scope of what happened next. These women had suffered because they'd been isolated and financially vulnerable. They deserved to know that this time, the Goldbergs had chosen the wrong target. The kind that can ensure they never do this to anyone else again," I said simply. "Are you both willing to help me make sure tomorrow's wedding becomes their last successful con?" The determination in their voices when they agreed told me everything I needed to know. We weren't victims anymore, we were an army, and the Goldbergs had no idea what was coming for them. The final piece of the puzzle arrived at 6 a.m. on the morning of Johnny's wedding, delivered in a manila envelope that Marcus had personally couriered to my hotel suite. Inside were documents that revealed the true scope of the Goldberg family's criminal enterprise, evidence so damning that it transformed my planned confrontation from personal revenge into something approaching a public service. The breakthrough had come from an unexpected source. Faye Anderson herself. Marcus's investigation had uncovered that Faye wasn't just Brad's current romantic target, she was a double agent, conducting her own investigation into the Goldberg family on behalf of her father's business interests. Richard Anderson had become suspicious of Johnny's sudden romantic pursuit of his daughter Amanda, especially given the timing of their engagement, coinciding with Goldberg Construction's financial difficulties. "She's been documenting everything," Marcus explained over our secure phone connection. "Recording conversations, photographing documents, tracking financial transactions. Her father hired private investigators 6 months ago, but Faye's inside access has provided evidence that external surveillance never could have obtained. The recordings Faye had made were devastating. In one, Brad explicitly discussed his exit strategy with Johnny, detailing how he planned to frame me for financial harassment if I demanded repayment of the money I'd provided. They laughed about my pathetic attempts to buy love and speculated about how much more they could extract before disposing of me. But the most chilling recording was a conversation between Noah and his sons about their next targets after the Anderson marriages were complete. They'd already identified 3 women in Chicago's professional community: a successful architect, a pharmaceutical executive, and a restaurant owner, who possessed the combination of financial resources and emotional vulnerability that fit their victim profile. The architect is perfect. Noah's voice crackled through the digital file. Recent divorce, overcompensating by being generous with everyone. She'd probably fund a full business expansion if we played it right. They discussed these women like livestock at auction, analyzing their psychological weaknesses and financial capabilities with clinical detachment. Johnny had already begun preliminary research on the restaurant owner, studying her social media patterns and identifying optimal approaches for accidental encounters. The pharmaceutical executive was being reserved for a cousin, David Goldberg, who was graduating from business school next year and would need initial capital to establish himself in their family tradition. They'd mapped out a multi-year timeline for cultivating her trust while systematically accessing her professional network and investment portfolio. But perhaps most disturbing was their discussion of past victims who had tried to expose them. Sarah Chen's nervous breakdown hadn't been a coincidental result of discovering Johnny's infidelity. It had been deliberately triggered through a campaign of psychological manipulation designed to discredit her potential testimony. When she'd threatened to go public with evidence of financial fraud, the Goldbergs had systematically destroyed her support network, convinced her friends and family that she was delusional, and arranged for her business accounts to be frozen through false fraud allegations. "We made her look crazy," Johnny boasted on the recording. "By the time we were done, even her own family thought she'd imagined half the stuff she was claiming about me." Jessica Morrison's bankruptcy hadn't been an unfortunate side effect of legal fees. It had been the intended outcome of a coordinated campaign to prevent her from having resources to continue fighting them. The Goldbergs had used shell companies to file false claims against her credit, created fake evidence of debt default, and arranged for her nursing license to be challenged through anonymous complaints to the medical board. "The key is making sure they can't recover financially or emotionally," Noah explained in one recording. "Broken people don't sue, they just disappear." The evidence revealed that the Goldberg family had been operating the scheme for over 20 years, with an estimated 37 victims who had lost a combined total of over $2 million. Many of the women had suffered career damage, psychological trauma, or financial ruin that prevented them from seeking justice. Several had attempted suicide, 2 had succeeded. The recordings included detailed discussions of how to select victims who were least likely to have family support or legal resources, how to time extraction periods to maximize profit while minimizing risk, and how to orchestrate disposal scenarios that would prevent future problems. They'd refined their techniques through decades of practice, creating a systematic method for destroying lives while maintaining plausible legal deniability. But the most shocking revelation was saved for last. Amanda Anderson wasn't an innocent bride being manipulated by Johnny. She was a willing participant in the scheme, working with her sister Faye to infiltrate and ultimately acquire Goldberg Construction's assets. The Anderson family had identified the Goldbergs as a financially vulnerable target, and had orchestrated the entire romance to position themselves for a hostile takeover of the construction business. The wedding I'd been excluded from wasn't a celebration of love. It was the final stage of a corporate acquisition disguised as a society event. Both families were predators who had found each other, and neither had any idea that their elaborate deceptions were about to collide with someone who commanded resources that dwarfed both of their operations combined. As I reviewed the complete evidence file, one thought crystallized with perfect clarity: the Goldberg family had spent decades perfecting the art of destroying people who trusted them. Today they were about to discover what happened when they targeted someone who had been raised to win wars they didn't even know they were fighting. The wedding was scheduled to begin in 6 hours. That gave me exactly enough time to arrange for their public destruction to unfold with the same systematic precision they'd used to destroy 37 innocent women. Justice, I reflected, was about to be served with unprecedented efficiency. The Cathedral of St. Mary had never hosted a wedding quite like the one I was orchestrating from behind the scenes. While Johnny Goldberg and Amanda Anderson prepared for what they believed would be their triumphant union, I spent the morning of their ceremony transforming their celebration into something far different, a precisely choreographed revelation that would expose decades of deception to Chicago's most influential families. At 7 a.m., I stood in the penthouse suite I'd maintained at the Ritz-Carlton, surveying an operation that would have impressed a military strategist. 3 laptops displayed real-time surveillance feeds from the cathedral and reception venue. Secure phones connected me to Marcus Rudd's team, positioned at strategic locations throughout the city. A conference table held documents, photographs, and digital evidence that would destroy the Goldberg family's reputation within hours. The first phase was already underway. Marcus had contacted key members of Chicago's business community, the same social circle that would be attending today's ceremony, with preliminary reports about potential financial irregularities involved in Goldberg construction. Nothing actionable yet, just enough information to ensure that certain influential guests would be paying very close attention to today's events. The mayor's office has been briefed, Marcus reported through our encrypted connection. They're sending an observer, officially to ensure security for such a high-profile event, but actually to witness whatever happens next. The media component required delicate handling. I'd arranged for 3 investigative journalists to receive anonymous tips about a developing story involving prominent Chicago families and potential financial crimes. They would be positioned outside the cathedral with full knowledge that something significant was about to unfold, but without enough advance information to publish premature reports. Sarah Chen and Jessica Morrison had flown in from their respective cities, not to attend the wedding but to serve as witnesses for what would happen afterward. They were stationed at the Bellamy Tower, ready to provide testimony and documentation the moment the Goldbergs' public exposure began. Their presence would transform today from personal revenge into systematic justice for multiple victims. The technical preparations were extensive. Marcus's team had installed discrete recording equipment throughout the cathedral and reception venue, ensuring that every conversation would be captured and preserved. The Goldbergs' phones had been compromised through sophisticated hacking that would allow us to monitor their communications in real time, documenting their reactions as their carefully constructed world collapsed around them. But the most crucial element was my own transformation back into Marissa Bellamy. The modest event coordinator who had been dismissed last night was about to be replaced by the hotel heiress whose family name commanded immediate recognition throughout Chicago's elite circles. In my suite's walk-in closet, I selected a Chanel suit that cost more than Brad's monthly salary, elegant but understated, expensive enough to signal serious wealth without appearing ostentatious. The jewelry was carefully chosen, my grandmother's diamond necklace, earrings that had belonged to a Russian princess, a watch whose value exceeded most people's annual income. Every element was designed to communicate power, sophistication, and old money heritage. The psychological preparation was equally important. For 3 years, I'd trained myself to think small, to accept dismissal, to be grateful for whatever attention I received. Today required the opposite mindset. The confidence that came from knowing I controlled resources and wielded influence that could reshape lives with a single decision. At 10 a.m., I placed the most important call of the morning. Arthur Bellamy's office, my father's assistant, answered. "This is Marissa. I need you to arrange for my arrival at St. Mary's Cathedral at exactly 2:30 p.m., full security detail. the Bentley, and please ensure that Father Morrison understands I'll be making a significant announcement during the ceremony." The pause that followed spoke volumes. "Miss Bellamy, your father is aware of today's activities. He's aware that the family honor requires certain actions," I replied carefully. "Please also arrange for our legal team to be standing by. There will likely be immediate need for counsel regarding fraud allegations and civil suits." The final preparation involved a personal decision that would permanently end my double life. I drafted 2 letters, one to the Palmer House management explaining that Marissa Cole would not be returning to her position due to changed circumstances, and another to Brad that would be delivered after today's events concluded. The letter to Brad was simple and devastating. "Thank you for teaching me exactly what I'm worth. The woman you dismissed as temporary has decided to make some permanent changes. Your belongings will be removed from our apartment by noon tomorrow. Don't contact me again." By 1 p.m., every element was in place. The guests were beginning to arrive at the cathedral, including Chicago's mayor, 3 city council members, and representatives from every major business family in the city. The media had positioned themselves strategically, alerted that something newsworthy would occur. Sarah and Jessica waited at the Bellamy Tower with legal counsel, ready to file formal complaints the moment today's revelations provided sufficient grounds. The Goldberg family believed they were hours away from their greatest triumph: Johnny's acquisition of the Anderson fortune and Brad's successful transition to a wealthier target. Instead, they were about to discover that their carefully orchestrated deception had collided with someone whose resources and determination far exceeded their capacity to comprehend or counter. As I prepared to leave my hotel suite and reclaim my real identity, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 3 years: complete authenticity. The performance was finally over. The real Marissa Bellamy was about to make her entrance, and the Goldberg family would learn exactly what it meant to underestimate a woman whose patience had officially expired. The wedding was about to begin, but their reckoning had already started. The Cathedral of St. Mary buzzed with the energy of Chicago's social elite as I slipped through the massive oak doors at precisely 2:30 p.m., 30 minutes before the ceremony was scheduled to begin. The afternoon light streaming through stained glass windows cast rainbow patterns across marble floors where 300 guests mingled in their finest attire, champagne glasses catching the light as conversations hummed with anticipation. I had deliberately timed my arrival for maximum impact. The Goldberg family stood near the altar in a receiving line, greeting guests with the confident air of people who believed they were minutes away from their greatest triumph. Noah wore a custom tuxedo that probably cost more than most people's cars. His silver hair perfectly styled, his smile radiating the satisfaction of a man whose long-term plans were finally coming to fruition. Hilda had positioned herself strategically to receive compliments on the wedding arrangements, accepting praise for the elaborate floral displays and crystal chandeliers with gracious modesty. She had no idea she was basking in admiration for details I had secretly funded, playing the role of generous mother-in-law, while the woman who'd made it all possible remained invisible. Brad stood beside his brother, resplendent in his groomsman tuxedo, his face glowing with barely contained excitement. Through Marcus's surveillance, I knew he'd been texting Faye Anderson all morning, counting down the hours until he could publicly claim his place in a wealthier family. His phone buzzed constantly with messages I was monitoring in real time. "Can't wait to leave the temp behind permanently, and tonight we celebrate the end of my slumming period." Johnny appeared calm and confident at the altar, shaking hands with Amanda's relatives and business associates, playing the role of devoted groom with practiced ease. He had no idea that his bride was conducting her own deception, that this entire ceremony was the culmination of competing cons that were about to collide spectacularly. I moved through the crowd like a ghost from their past, my Chanel suit and grandmother's diamonds drawing appreciative glances from guests who clearly recognized quality when they saw it. Several people nodded with the polite acknowledgement reserved for someone they couldn't quite place but knew was important. The mayor's wife actually stopped mid-conversation to study my jewelry, her expert eye immediately recognizing pieces that belonged in museum collections. "Excuse me," said a woman in Hermes, her tone carefully modulated with social curiosity. "I don't believe we've met. I'm Catherine Morrison from the Arts Foundation." "Marissa Bellamy," I replied simply, watching her expression change as recognition dawned. The Bellamy name carried weight in Chicago circles that money alone couldn't buy. Old family, established power, the kind of influence that shaped city policies and cultural institutions. "Bellamy," she repeated, her voice carrying just enough surprise to attract attention from nearby conversations. "As in Bellamy Hotels, I had no idea you were connected to this wedding." The ripple effect was immediate and devastating. Conversations paused as heads turned in my direction. The name Bellamy passed through the crowd like electricity, causing the social atmosphere to shift in ways the Goldberg family was too focused on their own success to notice. Until Hilda spotted me. I watched her face cycle through confusion, recognition, and mounting panic as she processed my presence. The modest event coordinator, who had been dismissed last night, had been replaced by someone who belonged in the social stratum far more naturally than the Goldbergs ever could. My posture, my clothing, the way other guests were beginning to gravitate toward me, with the instinctive deference wealthy people showed to even wealthier people, everything about my presence challenged the narrative she'd constructed about my place in their world. "What is she doing here?" I heard her whisper urgently to Noah, though her words carried farther than she intended in the acoustically perfect cathedral. Noah's response was swift and brutal. Rather than approaching me directly or attempting to understand what my presence meant, he made the decision that sealed his family's fate. I watched him signal to the cathedral's security staff, his gestures discreet but unmistakable. 2 uniformed guards approached me as I stood in conversation with the mayor's wife and 3 members of the City Planning Commission. The interruption was jarring, their presence immediately drawing attention from everyone within 50 feet. "Ma'am," the lead security guard said, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet space, "we're going to need you to leave the premises. There's been a complaint that you're not on the guest list." The silence that followed was profound. 300 of Chicago's most influential people turned to stare at the scene unfolding before them. Catherine Morrison's mouth dropped open in shock. The mayor's wife looked scandalized. Members of the Planning Commission, all of whom recognized me from city development meetings, exchanged confused glances. But it was Brad's reaction that crystallized the moment into something unforgettable. As he realized what was happening, his face transformed from confusion to horror to desperate damage control. He pushed through the crowd toward me, his expression pleading, but it was far too late for explanations. "There must be some mistake," he called out, his voice cracking with panic. "Marissa, I can explain." I looked at him with the serene calm of someone who held all the cards in a game he'd never understood he was playing. The woman he'd been manipulating for 3 years, the temporary funding source he'd planned to discard tonight, stood before him revealed as someone whose single phone call could destroy everything he'd worked to achieve. "No mistake at all," I said clearly, my voice carrying across the cathedral's perfect acoustics. "Some people just don't know their place." The security guards hesitated, clearly sensing that something fundamental had shifted in the dynamics of what they'd been asked to do. "And my place," I continued, looking directly at Noah Goldberg, "is wherever I choose it to be." The cathedral had fallen into the kind of silence that only occurred when 300 people simultaneously realized they were witnessing something extraordinary. I stood at the center of this hush, surrounded by Chicago's most powerful families, while two security guards waited for instructions they were no longer certain they should follow. The weight of every gaze pressed against me, but instead of the crushing embarrassment the Goldberg family had intended, I felt a profound sense of liberation. For 3 years I had diminished myself, made myself smaller, accepted treatment I would never have tolerated if these people had known who I really was. That performance was finally over. I looked at the security guards with gentle understanding, recognizing that they were simply following orders from people who had misrepresented the situation entirely. "Gentlemen," I said quietly, my voice carrying clearly in the perfect acoustics, "there's been a misunderstanding. Perhaps you should verify with Father Morrison whether my presence here is actually unwelcome." Father Morrison, who had been watching the scene unfold from near the altar, stepped forward immediately. His face showed the confusion of a man trying to reconcile the modest event coordinator he'd met during wedding planning sessions with the obviously wealthy woman now commanding the attention of his most influential parishioners. "Miss Bellamy," he said uncertainly, the name carrying questions he didn't know how to ask. "Yes, Father," I replied with a slight smile. "I believe there may have been some confusion about my identity during our previous meetings." The ripple effect of this exchange spread through the crowd like a stone dropped in still water. Conversations resumed in urgent whispers as guests processed the implications of what they were witnessing. The mayor's wife leaned toward her husband, her words audible in the crystalline silence. "That's Arthur Bellamy's daughter. The hotel heiress." I watched Noah Goldberg's face drain of color as the full scope of his mistake became clear. The woman his family had dismissed as unworthy of their company was revealing herself to be someone whose social and financial position far exceeded theirs. But rather than approaching to apologize or attempt damage control, he doubled down on his original decision with the stubborn pride that had defined his family's approach to intimidation. "I don't care who she claims to be," he said loudly enough for nearby guests to hear, his voice carrying the forced authority of a man who sensed his control slipping away. "She wasn't invited to this ceremony, and I want her removed immediately." The gasps from surrounding guests were audible. To publicly demand the removal of a Bellamy from a social event in Chicago was social suicide of the highest order. I saw several prominent business leaders exchange meaningful glances, their expressions suggesting that Noah had just made an enemy they wouldn't want to face. But I had no intention of creating a scene that would overshadow what was truly important, the justice that 37 women deserved, and the protection that future victims required. The woman who had learned to accept dismissal was gone, but the woman who replaced her understood that true power was exercised with precision rather than drama. I reached into my small Hermes clutch, a bag worth more than the Goldbergs' monthly mortgage payment, and withdrew a simple white envelope. The paper was heavy, expensive, embossed with the Bellamy family crest that anyone in Chicago society would recognize immediately. "Father Morrison," I said, extending the envelope toward him, "I believe this will clarify my presence here today." The priest accepted the envelope with hands that trembled slightly, though whether from confusion or anticipation I couldn't say. As he opened it and began reading, his expression transformed from uncertainty to shock to something approaching awe. Inside was a single sheet of letterhead that bore the official seal of the Bellamy Foundation, along with a brief note in my handwriting. "Father Morrison, please accept the enclosed donation to St. Mary's Cathedral Restoration Fund, given in honor of today's ceremony. I hope this clarifies any questions about my welcome here. Miss Bellamy." Attached to the note was a certified check for $500,000. The priest looked up at me, then at the check, then back at me. his face cycling through expressions of gratitude, confusion, and dawning understanding. "Miss Bellamy," he said, his voice carrying across the silent cathedral, "this is extraordinarily generous." I smiled with the serene confidence of someone who had just reminded everyone present exactly who held real power in this room. "My family believes in supporting institutions that serve our community, Father. I hope the restoration project proceeds smoothly." The effect on the assembled guests was immediate and profound. Conversations erupted in urgent whispers, as the implications of what they'd witnessed spread through the crowd. The woman the Goldbergs had tried to have removed had just made a donation that exceeded most people's annual income, demonstrating both her financial capacity and her social position with elegant simplicity. But I wasn't finished. I turned to address Noah Goldberg directly, my voice carrying the quiet authority that came from knowing I held cards he couldn't match. "Mr. Goldberg," I said, my tone perfectly polite, "I understand there may have been some confusion about my relationship to your family. Perhaps we should discuss this matter privately after the ceremony, so as not to disturb your son's special day further." The offer was phrased as a courtesy, but everyone present understood it as exactly what it was, a declaration of war delivered with impeccable manners. I nodded graciously to Father Morrison, smiled politely at the mayor's wife, and walked with perfect composure toward a pew near the back of the cathedral, leaving behind a crowd buzzing with speculation, and a family finally beginning to understand the magnitude of their mistake. The wedding could proceed as planned. The reckoning would come later. The ceremony proceeded with forced normalcy, while I sat in the back pew watching the Goldberg family struggle to maintain their composure as their carefully orchestrated celebration crumbled around them. Johnny's voice cracked during his vows, his eyes darting nervously toward me every few minutes. Amanda smiled serenely, blissfully unaware that her new husband was sweating through his custom tuxedo, or that her sister Faye was recording every moment from the balcony above. But the real devastation was happening beyond the cathedral walls, coordinated through discreet signals I sent via encrypted messages. Each phase of my response unfolded with military precision, targeting the foundations of everything the Goldbergs had built through decades of systematic fraud. At 3:47 p.m., as Johnny kissed his bride to scattered applause from confused guests, Marcus Rudd's team delivered evidence packages to the offices of 5 major construction companies throughout Chicago. Each package contained detailed documentation of Goldberg Construction's fraudulent bidding practices, along with proof that they'd been using stolen capital, my money, to underbid legitimate competitors on municipal contracts. By 4:15 p.m., as guests moved to the reception venue, the Chicago Tribune's investigative team had received comprehensive files detailing the Goldberg family's 37-victim fraud scheme. The story would run in tomorrow's Sunday edition, but preliminary reports were already being circulated to key advertising partners, who did business with companies the Goldbergs hoped to acquire through their Anderson marriages. The financial destruction began at 4:23 p.m. Phone calls from my father's office reached every major bank in Chicago, alerting them to potential fraud investigations involving Goldberg Construction's accounts. While no accounts were frozen, that would require court orders. The inquiries triggered automatic reviews that would reveal discrepancies the family couldn't explain without admitting to systematic theft from romantic partners. At the reception, I watched Noah Goldberg's face as he received the first call from his primary lender. His expression shifted from confusion to alarm, to barely controlled panic as he stepped away from the head table, phone pressed to his ear, his voice rising despite obvious attempts to maintain composure. "What do you mean irregularities?" I heard him hiss into the phone, his words carrying farther than intended in the acoustically challenging ballroom. "We've banked with you for 15 years. Hilda intercepted him before he could return to the table, their urgent whispered conversation drawing attention from nearby guests who were already buzzing about the afternoon's cathedral incident. I watched her gesture frantically in my direction, her social mask finally slipping to reveal the desperation beneath. Brad appeared at my table uninvited, his face pale and desperate. "Marissa, please, whatever you're planning, we can work this out. I can explain everything." I looked up at him with the serene calm of someone holding overwhelming advantages in a game he'd never understood. "Brad, I believe you mentioned that some people don't know their place. I'm simply helping everyone find theirs." The evening's entertainment was just beginning, and I had front row seats to watch 3 generations of predators discover exactly what happened when they targeted someone whose resources exceeded their capacity to comprehend or survive. The systematic destruction of their empire had only just begun. The revelation came at exactly 8:30 p.m., timed perfectly as the reception reached its peak celebration. I stood gracefully from my table as Marcus Rudd entered the ballroom, flanked by 2 Chicago police detectives and a representative from the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. The conversations around me died, as guests recognized the gravity of official law enforcement presence at what was supposed to be a joyous social gathering. But the true masterstroke was what happened next. The ballroom's main screens, which had been displaying a slideshow of Johnny and Amanda's engagement photos, suddenly switched to display documents that every guest could read clearly: bank records, forged contracts, and recorded conversations that laid bare 37 cases of systematic romantic fraud spanning 2 decades. "Ladies and gentlemen," I announced, my voice carrying clearly across the stunned reception hall, "I apologize for interrupting this celebration, but I believe you should know exactly what kind of family you're honoring tonight." The evidence spoke for itself. Sarah Chen's voice filled the ballroom through hidden speakers, describing how Johnny had manipulated her into mortgaging her family's restaurant. Jessica Morrison's testimony followed, detailing Brad's systematic financial exploitation disguised as love. One by one, the voices of women who had been silenced by trauma and legal intimidation filled the space where Chicago's elite had gathered to celebrate what they now realized was a criminal enterprise. Noah Goldberg lurched to his feet, his face purple with rage and panic. "This is a setup. She's a disturbed woman trying to destroy my family because my son rejected her." But his protests died as the final recording began to play. His own voice, captured just hours earlier through Faye Anderson's hidden recording device, discussing plans to acquire 3 new targets and methods for ensuring broken victims can't fight back. The reaction was immediate and devastating. Mayor Hendricks stood and walked out without a word, followed by every city council member present. Business leaders who had been considering partnerships with the Goldbergs gathered their families and departed in disgusted silence. Within 20 minutes, the reception hall had emptied except for family members and the law enforcement officials who now surrounded the head table. Amanda Anderson sat frozen in her wedding dress, staring at her new husband as the scope of his family's operation became clear. But it was Faye who provided the final twist, stepping forward with a briefcase full of documents that revealed her own year-long investigation on behalf of her father. "The Anderson family has been documenting your crimes for months," she announced coldly to Brad, whose face had gone completely white. "Did you really think we'd let our family be infiltrated by common criminals?" As the FBI began reading rights to Noah, Johnny, and Brad, I walked calmly to the exit, pausing only to address the few remaining guests. "The Bellamy Foundation will ensure that all 37 victims receive full restitution and support for rebuilding their lives. As for the Goldberg family, they'll finally learn what it means to face consequences for their actions." Outside, Sarah Chen and Jessica Morrison waited with reporters from 3 major news outlets. Tomorrow, the story would be front-page news across the country, Chicago hotel heiress exposes multi-generational romance fraud ring. The woman they'd dismissed as unworthy had just destroyed their family legacy with the same systematic precision they'd used to destroy innocent lives. Justice, it turned out, was a Bellamy family tradition.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.